Hi, welcome to RockCreek Insights. This is a terrific panel with three fabulous female economists, and it's about the economy and women in the economy post-COVID. And I'm just briefly going to tell you who are the three panelists now, but then I will have them introduce themselves. So Joyce Chang, who is head of global research at JP Morgan Chase, and she began doing emerging markets, if I'm allowed to say that, Joyce, and really set the goals and the way of doing that for Wall Street in general. Penny Goldberg, who is the Elihu Professor of Economics at Yale and was chief economist at the World Bank also. And Cathy Mann, who is managing director and global head of research at Citibank and was formerly in policy as well, including for a long time as the chief economist at the OECD. So as we know, economics and finance is not a woman's world, even though all of us have to some extent succeeded in it. And we've all worked in that field in different areas which are also male dominated, whether it's Penny in academia, Cathy in the policy world, and Joyce in Wall Street. These are all areas where the economics is very, the economics and finance are really male dominated, and that's been the same for me. So what we've also realized though, and partly because of the work of people like these three, it's very important to have women's voices in economics. After all, apart from the fact that it's important to have women's voices everywhere, we're half of the world, the way that women approach some of these economic issues is particularly important. And the participation of women in the economy is important for everybody and is more likely to be observed, commented on, understood if you have women pursuing the research, pursuing the understanding about investments and making policy. So I want to ask each of you to give just a brief update or background on yourselves and what you see as most important right now in terms of the work that you've been doing on the economy and on women and the role of women in the economy and in your fields. So I'm going to start with Cathy and then go to Joyce and then Penny, and then we'll have a more open discussion. So Cathy, first to you.
So thanks very much, Caroline, for initiating this conversation that we're going to have on a wide range of topics. You know, my background as a woman in international economics, I've done it in policy at the Federal Reserve and at the OECD. You know, I've done it in the academic world as a professor at Brandeis University, and now, you know, now I'm doing it in the world of private finance. So, you know, I've taken my lens, which is as an international economist. That's the one I have always taken. It's my background, and applied that lens to different audiences, wherever, you know, whichever the audience is, whether it's, you know, undergraduates or PhDs, whether it's the CEO and the CFO at Citi, or clients, or, you know, the board of governors when I work there. So, you know, in terms of point of view and a different sort of role to play, I think that one difference that I think is certainly apparent in the way that I do business is that I really promote my people. Whether I'm promoting a PhD student, whether I'm promoting a member of my own team at Citi, or whether I was promoting other people when I was working, you know, in the head office in the International Finance Division at the Federal Reserve Board. My success, in my view, you know, I succeed if my team succeeds, and you know, that's my job. My job is to really get the team to succeed. And again, maybe it's a team of like a 2 co-authored piece, or it's a team where At Citi, I give lead authorship to a junior person if they're the lead author. I always get to be second, because I spend a lot of time on the pieces. But that's the way my vision works. And I can tell you, that's not the way a lot of other people work. And I think it matters in terms of the voices that you hear, the talent development, which I think is extremely important. We're always part of a pipeline. We're either at the top of the pipeline or the bottom of the pipeline, beginning or the end. So it matters. It matters a whole lot. And the more that we can see that pipeline role, I think is superior for whichever audience you're talking to and dealing with, whether it's academic policy or the private sector. So that's kind of the way I approach this particular question. We can talk more about women in the economy. We do a lot of work on that, particularly at Citi. We've done a lot of and of course at the OECD, when I was chief economist there, tremendous focus on the role for women in the economy became a important ingredient in our G20 efforts when I was chief economist at the OECD.
Yeah, no, that's right. Thanks very much. And actually, I had a lovely comment yesterday from somebody who was texting me that I used to work with, who said he was telling me something as me being the spiritual leader of the group that I ran in the White House, which was just a very nice thought for me. So, and obviously teamwork is important. And I should point out that, of course, Cathy now works in a major investment bank that is now being run by a woman, Jane Fraser. And that is pretty exciting, I think, for all of us, because role models and pipelines are incredibly important. They're important for everybody. So I'd like to go now to Joyce. I know JP Morgan's also been doing a lot of work on women, and then you've made it in this male world of Wall Street for sure.
Well, Caroline, it's so great to be with all of you, and thank you, RockCreek, Caroline, for the invitation. And it's just great to be with so many women who I just admire and respect so much. So my background, I have now been 32 years working in research on Wall Street. And I always say that for women, every year is a dog year. So how many years is that when you actually look at the amount of time I've spent in research? But very much agree with Catherine's points that research is the ultimate team sport. And if you want to bring in innovation and good ideas and really address the global issues, I mean, you need to make it a team sport. So I just wanted to reiterate that. But at JP Morgan, I'm the executive sponsor for our women's network for the investment bank. It's called Women on the Move. I'm also the executive sponsor for our Asian employee network and our nonprofit board service. And so there's a few things I would just say about the women's network at JP Morgan, which has been a real sea change compared to a lot of the activities in the first 3 decades that I had worked on. A couple of years ago, Jamie Dimon really made a decision that I want to take our employee networks and I want to put them into the community. And so he actually said, the target for Women on the Move is that you lend $10 billion to women-owned businesses. And then last October, we came up with a $30 billion target to address racial inequality and climate change. So he's really sort of quantified what he wants to have done in addressing whether it's gender inequality or racial inequality and target local communities. And so that really changed the whole nature of the employee networks, which still spends a lot of time on how we develop talent and retain talent and build skills, but also put in just a completely different dimension of how we work with local institutions. And even this week, with all of the increase in anti-Asian violence, I mean, we're coming out with an initiative later that I've been working on later this afternoon on working with 3 local organizations, and a lot of it is focused on Asian women, just given the nature of the issues that are occurring currently. So I think that there's the teamwork aspect, but there's also how you can actually take this network and make more of an impact? And that goes to sort of your broader question, like just the areas that we're working on in research. And so I'm an emerging market specialist by training, but I have now moved to more doing these sort of big picture ideas. And so what I kind of call them is, paradigm shifts that are changing the world. So what is it that, I'm writing about? First, there is just the whole ESG agenda. And that's very much one that I think, was something that was seen as a nice to have, now is a must have. And certainly for younger generations, it's a huge, issue on just where they want to work, how they want to work, what the future of work is going to look like. The second issue I spent a lot of time on is US-China, which I do think is the biggest geopolitical risk, longer term to monitor. The third one is just the effects of unconventional monetary policy, zero interest rates, how that's changed the world for central bankers. Is it more about financial stability than the traditional monetary policy? And then I spent a lot of time looking at market structure, market liquidity, the rise of passive investment, the rise of retail investment, Bitcoin, digital finance, some of the ways in which market structure is really transforming here. So those are some of the big areas that I work on as a researcher, but we put out a gender report every March for Women's History Month. I'm very happy to share it with everyone. It is a report where we really do try to cover just a lot of the global trends. We look at the private sector and also what's happening in leadership in the public sector. And we've also tried to do a breakdown looking at race and emerging markets versus developed markets.
That's great. And talking about young people, I want to go to Penny. Penny, I think you're on mute, so you probably need to unmute yourself. And then I also just want to tell everybody that if you would like to ask us anything, make comments, please use the Q&A function. I know there are a bunch of people watching who will have different questions for these panelists that we've got. So over to you, Penny. And I noticed Joyce talking about young people, and I guess that you're having a lot of interactions with young people right now.
That's right. So first of all, thank you very much, Caroline, for organizing this panel. It's a pleasure to be part of it. Also, thank you for bringing up a very important point, which is part of the reason we want more women in academia or policy is because you get a different perspective. And I think this became very clear last year. We talked relatively little about how COVID affected women. And I think it was mostly women who put that in the, who talked about that and pointed out that the effects were different between men and women. Personally, my own background is mostly in international trade and international economics, so very similar to Cathy's background. I had not worked on gender issues as a research area, so of course, as an academic, you are constantly confronted with gender issues because academia in economics is dominated by men. When I entered graduate school, my class had 25 students, I believe, were 3 women. 25 years later, it was exactly the same. Nothing had changed. And things started changing only in the last 5 years. I think it's fair to say that in the last 5 years, we're in a very different environment. So I had thought a lot about these issues and how to bring more women in economics in the context of academia. And then I didn't start thinking about research until I went to the World Bank, about research on women. And the reason is, you are confronted with a reality in developing countries, and you realize you cannot talk about development without addressing gender issues in developing countries. So I got more and more interested in this area, but again, mostly from an advocacy point of view. And I had very mixed feelings about it because, for example, right now I have several projects that make the point that when you don't include women in the economy loses. You are worse off. You are leaving money on the table. In some sense, I have mixed feelings about that because we shouldn't be feel compelled to make the point that women are viable as economic agents to require that they receive the same quality of education and the same rights as men. Ultimately, it's a human rights issue. It's not just an economic issue. Nevertheless, when you are in policy, you realize that the only way to have some impact to change things is to convince policymakers that this is an agenda worth pursuing. And the best way to do that is to prove that there is an economic benefit. So I got more and more into this research agenda of trying to show that actually women contribute to the economy substantially, and economies that exclude women are economies that are worse off. So I have several projects that make this point these days. So that's one area. Then, as you mentioned, I also interact a lot with young people in academia. And there I think it's worth thinking, first of all, why do we want more women? There are two issues that I believe are very important. One is what we just mentioned, women bring a different perspective. But the other issue is one of role models. And there are some kids when they're 14, 15 years old, they know exactly what they want to do. They have their future mapped out for them. But most kids are not like that. Most kids say, I'm interested in this and that. I'm not quite sure what I want to do in life. And then they look around them and they ask themselves the question, who is like me? Who looks like me? Who behaves like me? Who talks like me? And then naturally, they go into the direction where they feel more accepted. Now, if you apply this kind of thinking to economics, there are so few women who would inspire entry by other women in the field that I think at least until 5 years ago, many women would feel discouraged. So I think it's important also from that point of view to bring more women into the field. And then the big question for us has always been, where do you start, right? It's very hard to tenure women if there are very few assistant professors. It's very hard to hire assistant professors if there are few graduate students. It's very hard to admit graduate students into a PhD program when there are few undergrads. And you see women leaving economics even at the undergraduate stage. Even at the undergraduate stage, you have fewer women than men. So, so these are all issues one needs to carefully consider.
Yeah, those are great points. And I must say that I think you're right that there has been a change. I mean, partly, as Joyce was talking about, there's been a change in the last several years in the United States, certainly, and perhaps more generally, certainly in the United States, to think about some of the ignored minorities, racially, ethnically, and then of course women are not a minority, but there was more of a push there. And we shouldn't forget that now we have a US Treasury Secretary who is a woman. Now, she happens to be a woman who, this is another thing that often happens, that you'll have a very successful woman and then everybody thinks, oh, we must have that particular woman for whichever job it is we've got, or whichever board it is we've got. And so broadening the pool is important. But I certainly remember when I was at Treasury, there were no women in the most senior jobs, and this was 20 years ago. And now there are, well, apart from Janet Yellen, there are others that have been announced, and I think that's really important from a role model point of view. And of course, we had Christine Lagarde and then Kristalina Georgieva at the IMF. We have the chief economists for the for the international institutions, and now all women. And it was amazing when Cathy, I think you were probably the first,
the OECD, yeah.
The OECD, and that was a tremendous success. So maybe we can, at least in our fields, see more development. Not quite sure how great it is, the pipeline in Wall Street, but I would like to turn back to Joyce, actually, both to address do you see a different pipeline and different issues, different faces around the table, and then the issue of this corona recession, which has particularly hurt working women, and especially as I'm sure your report shows, minority women, Black women, Hispanic women. And what lessons should we take from that? And by the way, on Asian American women, the expectation, the belief is that probably they have also been hurt by this recession as a service recession, but the data are not so readily available. And maybe that will be something that will change with the increased emphasis now on the particular issues for Asian Americans. But do you expect that this COVID impact on female labor force participation is going to be permanent? And then I'd like to turn next to Cathy to say if it is, well, same question, but also is it costly? But Joyce first.
No, thanks so much, Caroline, for that question. So we actually have seen a record drop in the U.S. female labor force participation rate. We're actually at the lowest levels in 33 years after making really big gains, and that's because of the unique nature of this recession, that it hit the services sector, and also because women bear greater responsibilities for childcare. They were disproportionately affected. And if you take a look at the economic data, I mean, you can really see this very clearly. Like if you look at what happened between May and September when the school year started, if you look at the month of September, at the start of the school year, you actually had 4 times as many as women drop out of the labor force. Now, some of this is transitory because some of these jobs will come back, but what I'm more concerned about is that it widens the gender gap. That you have a change in work structure and the future of work and even consumer habits that come about that will affect the services sector, and that women could come back in jobs that are more irregular, have less benefits and less job security. So we've really taken a look at all of the economic work that's out there and looked at the potential for this to widen the gender gap. And we think, if you look at the numbers that are put out by NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, I mean, they are coming out with an estimate that you could have a gender earnings gap that is as great as 5 percentage points from all of this. So it's not just that you had the record drop in the female labor participation, it's just that the nature of the jobs because of this recession really did widen the inequities. And I did want to talk about the racial inequity. It's not just the gender inequality. So if we look at Black women, they had some of the largest employment gains from 2015 to 2019. But during the pandemic, Black female participation rate dropped 6.4 percentage points from February to September. So that was a much greater decline than the 2008 global financial crisis. And this was put out by the Dallas Federal Reserve. We've also done a deep dive in looking at the Chase credit card data, and the Chase deposit numbers and a lot of the savings numbers that we've aggregated, in a big data analysis. And the JP Morgan Chase Institute finds that Black and Latinx women earn just 58 and 59 cents on the dollar, respectively, compared to white men. You're absolutely right that for Asians, a lot of this data isn't available. And for all of us who are, sort of on this call and we're researchers, the data is a really big problem. A lot of people have asked why ESG has not had more focus on gender. And part of that is that you can't get the data. So the 2 things that you can collect data on reliably are women on boards and women in C-suite. So that's why when you look at a lot of the ESG metrics, 96 of them, people ask, why are only 2 of them gender? Because if you're trying to create an index or something where you have to rebalance it and measure it and market to market, if there's a survey that comes out every 2 years or once a year, it's not enough of a data series and a data point that you can really put it into an investment product. So we have seen that the historic declines for women in the labor force. We've seen even more disparities when you look at the emerging markets. You're looking at the IMF members, 54% of women working in social sectors cannot telework. But if you go to Brazil, it's 67%. If you go to the lowest income countries and emerging markets, only 12% of the population can work remotely. So it has had a disproportionate effect in women in emerging markets as well.
Yeah, thanks for that rather gloomy picture. Cathy, what's your reaction?
Well, let me, I just want to sort of comment a little bit on the previous riff, which was about role models and pipelines. And just sort of to kind of give some, concrete references from my own experience. When I was in high school, I started to work at a company called Data Resources. You might not remember that company, but it is now part of, IHS Global Insight and whatever else market. So it is now, a huge company. But I started working there in high school. And that made a big difference about where I was going to go and what I was going to do when I went to college, speaking what Penny was saying. And I used to go, when I was more of on the academic side of things, I'd often go to the high schools, go to high school classes and talk about, what do I do? to give people an idea of the range of activities that you could do as an economist. And then, of course, when I went to Harvard as an undergraduate, I had two female professors, one of whom was Janet Yellen, right? So, you know, that starts the ball rolling. And of course, Janet and I have crossed paths in a number of different venues, the Federal Reserve, the G20, and lots of other conferences. But the other woman who was one of my undergraduate professors, Rachel McCullough, who now unfortunately has passed, but she was a professor at Brandeis. And the key point here is that whenever a position came open at Brandeis, she had the Rolodex of women who were good matches for the position, so that you never could say, oh, we don't really know kind of who might fit. We don't know any women. She had the Rolodex. That was the women. And that's why I ended up going ultimately to Brandeis as the Rosenberg Professor of Global Finance, was because she had the Rolodex and she knew that I was going to be a good fit. She also knew that I was available or could be convinced to come over to Brandeis. And so the key point here is not just about role models, but the key point is about Rolodex. You know, we all know people who can serve on panels and in positions, and the headhunters call me all the time. It's like, you know, who do you suggest? They're not asking for me, but they're asking for my suggestions. And so that's a really important role that we can play. But turning to the issue at hand about you know, the potential permanent scarring associated with COVID, particularly for women. Joyce has really outlined the issues kind of from the current viewpoint, but I'd like to pivot a little bit to think about this longer term question about you know, longer term potential output and what kind of scarring there can be in the labor market. We know that there's a lot of scarring in terms of capital formation, in terms of productivity and innovation that could be a consequence. Maybe there'll be good outcomes from creative destruction, but at least in the near term, a lot of scarring. But on the labor market side, the issues that I'm concerned about is that, you know, the types of jobs that are going to be coming out of a post-COVID, you know, evolution, not maybe 2022, but into 2023 and onward like that, they're going to be a different set of jobs. They may well be more jobs that were traditionally men's jobs, maybe construction, maybe putting solar panels on the roof. We're talking about warehousing. We're talking about, you know, moving the forklift around. Yes, there will be healthcare jobs. Clearly, there will be healthcare jobs, but I worry that there's this bifurcation in traditional job categories. Women take these kinds of jobs, men take those kind of jobs, and I think one of the consequences of the post-COVID environment, which is perhaps more IT related, more you know, less customer service related, as that is automated, as customer services are automated, that many the traditional places for many women may be eroded. And so part of the challenge of coming out of COVID better than when we went into it is about ensuring the capacity to have people, especially women, but people in general, to transition to the new set of jobs. This is not something that any economy has done a good job with, let's face it. And so the challenge is really there, but I think it is increasingly stark that if we can't manage this challenge of labor market transitions, we are setting ourselves up for yet another decade of slow, low productivity, globalization backlash, populist uplash, and rising inequalities. And so this is, you know, this is an incredibly important moment to get policies right.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, you're also right that no economy has been very good at managing transitions, supporting transitions. That certainly in the US, I think there's a recognition that the attempts to do that in the context of free trade agreements were not very successful, and there were still communities that really hurt. So I'd like to go to Penny and ask about how you see these issues of female labor force participation and the prospects going forward. And we do know from some recent research that actually it's possible for policies to support women working, whether these are childcare policies, paid leave, and other things which have been more frequent, used more in Europe or in some European countries than in the United States. And of course, that's part of what is being talked about now. But I don't know if that's enough. As Cathy was talking about traditionally male jobs in construction and so on, I was thinking about, and maybe this is silly, but I get a little sort of pop of pleasure if I see that, you know, there is a female taxi driver or a female wearing a hard hat. And of course, in the Soviet Union, there were plenty. So sometimes you need more physical strength that on average, you know, the average man would have more than the average woman, but that's not necessarily the case. I think operating a forklift is probably not so much about physical strength as some other skills. But let me go over to Penny and get your thoughts on these issues.
Yes, so Joyce and Cathy laid out the issues very well. So I don't have anything to add to the pessimistic view of the world. But I want to make one point that's more on the optimistic side. I also believe that we are at a point in time where there is enormous opportunity for women in the future. And to a certain extent, the pandemic created this opportunity. And what I mean by that is the following. As we all agree, we are not going to go back to work as normal. The jobs after the pandemic are not going to be the same as before. And specifically, there is enormous demand for more flexibility in work. This is not just because of the pandemic. This had started even before the pandemic, but people wanted more flexible work arrangements. This is something that could benefit women tremendously because women traditionally have sought flexibility. And this has also been viewed as a factor that at times held women back, because especially when women had families, had children, they had to take time off to make sure, or they had to choose career paths that would allow them to accommodate family needs. It's not just children, it's also taking care of elderly parents and so on. We see that even more in emerging economies and developing countries where most women are employed in the informal sector. And there are many reasons for that, of course, that the informal sector is prevalent in these countries. But one of the reasons we see that is, again, because women seek these more flexible work arrangements. So if we go to a new mode of work where these flexible work arrangements become more common, so let's say people go back to the office, but they don't go back to the office 5 days a week. They go back to the office 2 or 3 days a week. This is something that could potentially be a game changer for women. And I think what we need to make sure, and there I fully agree that policy, there is role for policy, and policy could make a huge difference, is we need to make sure that these are good jobs, they're paid well, and that women have the right skills to take advantage of them. Along the same lines, I agree it's nice to see you know, a woman as a taxi driver or with a hard hat. And in fact, you know, I always tip more if there is a woman who drives a cab. But on the other hand, the jobs of the future are not in mining. The jobs of the future are in the service sector. And of course, the pandemic was a major shock to the service sector, but eventually it's going to come back. You know, not all jobs in the service sector are paying well. We have, even before the pandemic, the nature of work was changing. We had new technologies, we had automation, we had, you know, the invasion of robots. Everyone was expecting that this would increase inequalities because those at the top and those at the bottom. And the big challenge across the world and across genders was to make sure that people develop the right skills to take advantage of these new technologies without being left behind. So if we apply this to the gender issue, I think the priority, in my view, would be to make sure that women can fully take advantage of this new reality. Because in my view, this flexibility of work arrangements can be a true game changer. One more point, just quickly. I think this needs to be paired with childcare policies. And again, the pandemic provided many useful lessons. Of course, everyone had more flexibility. We all worked from home. But if you were stuck home with 3 young children, it was impossible to work. So the heterogeneity in productivity was enormous. It's very hard to measure. So Joyce talked about data challenges. It's hard in some countries to even measure labor force participation. You can imagine how hard it is to measure productivity by gender. But there are many anecdotal reports how many women could simply not work during this time. So if we embrace these flexible work arrangements, we also need to make sure that there is childcare, there is high quality childcare, and it's cheap or ideally free for everyone. And I think if we did all this, if we embrace the right policies, the path for women could be a very bright one.
Thanks. And I know that that you have done some work, Penny, for the Peterson Institute that is looking at these issues, and that's very interesting. I'm not sure. I just want to let Joyce know that we can't see you at the moment, or at least I can't.
Sorry.
There you go. Sometimes that's great. Thank you. I wanted to move a little bit away from just the female issues and look at the more general issues for the economy, because I do think that to the extent that women have some of the more marginal jobs, running an economy hot can pull them in. And there is, of course, a big debate at the moment about an academic debate and it will develop into more of a policy debate around the immediate outlook for the global economy. Obviously, Larry Summers, the former Democrat advisor both to Presidents Obama and Clinton, Treasury Secretary under Clinton, argued that maybe the $1.9 trillion package was too much and could be inflationary. And I think he was joined by Olivier Blanchard, although both of them have also recently put forward work saying we shouldn't worry so much about deficits and debt. I think that many forecasters, certainly Cathy, your former employers at the OECD, but also JP Morgan, others have been revising upwards their growth forecasts as a result of the really huge fiscal stimulus, fiscal packages, and that we've had over the last year, and also the Fed pledges to hold monetary policy, to hold short-term interest rates low. So I would love to hear, and maybe I'll start with Penny, love to hear how you see the trade-offs between inflation and growth now in the US, and of course we're seeing somewhat different policies elsewhere. And are we seeing a regime shift now towards a different monetary fiscal policy mix? I mean, we had this decade of where monetary policy was the only game in town, and central bank independence was revered, and central bankers were revered, and they were sort of expected to do everything. And that coincided, as you just pointed out, Penny, with a big increase in inequality that has some, well, we talked about economic scarring, but I think that created political scarring. So how do you see the trade-offs going forward? Are we in, of course, are we in danger? And I'll come to Cathy and Joyce afterwards, because these views are very hot in Wall Street. But first to Penny.
So let me start by saying that, if you asked me this question a few months ago, I very much agreed with what Olivier Blanchard and Larry Summers said at the time. And actually most economists, I believe, that this was not the time to worry about deficits and debt, that we should spend, that it was more important than ever to support the economy. I think there was no dissent on this view at the time. And then now we're at a point where there has been so much money put into the economy that many people who are on the progressive side are getting nervous and have started worrying about deficits and debt and potential inflation. So the fact is, for the last decade or more, there has been no inflation. We can look at what happened in Japan, for example. The problem is the lack of inflation. Even modest inflation won't be that bad. We all agree on that. But I think the real issue, in my view, is that we are in new territory, and perhaps we should admit that. that we simply have no idea how these huge deficits and these huge debt levels are going to affect the economy. We all just speculate. And the reason many are getting nervous at this point, it's something that we have not experienced before. Now, the US economy is a powerful economy. It can probably sustain much higher debt levels than any other economy. But does this mean you can take on infinite debt? I do not know. I think no one knows, and that's why people are getting nervous. So that's point one. The second point is, personally, I was always optimistic about the aggregate growth numbers. I thought during the pandemic, there was pent-up demand. Once the economy opens up, and to a certain extent, the United States economy has been opening up in the last few months. Once a large share of the population is vaccinated, we won't go back to normal, but it will open up even more. Once this happens, demand will be back. There has been a very aggressive stimulus package. The aggregate growth numbers are going to look great. In my view, the real challenge has been on what you just mentioned, Caroline, on inequalities and how these are managed. And so it's conceivable that the economy, the aggregate numbers look great, the stock market is doing great, and yet there are still people falling through the cracks. And we need to pay a lot of attention to these particular segments of the population. Who are these segments? Minorities were hit very hard by the pandemic. Women were hit hard, and we don't talk about this very much. I think the young people, young in general, paid a disproportionate price, and we should worry about that. We always say they're young, they will figure it out, but there are issues of mental health, there are issues of long-run trajectories that we don't talk about, but these issues are important. And most important, in my view, is the issue of education, because again, not everyone, but a certain segment of the population missed a year of education. And if you had two educated parents at home, maybe you were even better off. Imagine those kids who were at home with two PhD parents. They did better than before. And then you had households where there was no access to computers, to internet, no space for the kids to study. How this is going to affect their long-run trajectories is an open question. So I think we need targeted measures, targeted specifically to addressing the concerns, the pain of these segments of the population. So the aggregate growth numbers, I think, are going to look great, but they are going to tell us very little about how healthy the economy and the country is going to be in the long run.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. One of my daughters is actually a public high school teacher in New York City, in a rather poor area of New York City. And so she sees a lot of these issues up close with her students. Cathy, I'd love your reaction on this. Are we seeing a regime shift? Do we actually is anybody who's forecasting being pretending to know something that is unknowable about inflation and growth? How do you see that?
Well, I mean, I think that what we have to do, I don't know about a regime shift. I mean, it's certainly the package of fiscal and monetary policies combined, particularly in the United States, are dramatic. Does it represent a regime shift or, more of something that we've seen before? We also, I think, have to look at what's going on in the U.S. And span it in the global context. So let me just comment on, how we're looking at this, since we do have to try to forecast these things. We have a global growth. We do have a global growth forecast. It has been upgraded 70 basis points over the last 3 months. We have to do this forecast exercise every month. It's a bottom-up exercise from all of our country economists. What is notable about that forecast, even though that sounds great, 70 basis point increase to being 5.5 this year and 4 next year. 4 is above what our averages for historical averages look like. So this all looks very good. But when you place that trajectory of growth rates against the pre-COVID GDP trajectory for the global economy, what that tells us is we only get back to the trajectory from January 2020, we only get back to that trajectory, struggle to get to it by the end of 2024. So,
and that's for the global economy. Sorry to interrupt. Is that?
Yes, that's for the global economy, which I think is the important. Well, I mean, you know, the U.S. economy is important, but let me tell you why this matters, because you end up with no inflation under that scenario when we do our bottom-up exercise, because you have never had a recovery. You had a rebound, but you never had a recovery of lost GDP. And I think this is a really important point to make, because we actually have data from the global financial crisis where there was a permanent loss to GDP at the global level of about 7% of GDP. And we know that it had a disproportionate impact on the low-income individuals within a cohort. It had a disproportionate effect on younger cohorts, birth cohorts, and it had a disproportionate impact on those who held their wealth in interest-bearing assets. So we kind of know that history, and it kind of looks like we're replaying that movie, which is I think why fiscal policy authorities have really tried to make a different approach this time with much bigger fiscal packages. Now, we also have done scenarios where we do a top-down exercise, if you put a huge amount of fiscal impetus in, and what happens. So under those circumstances, under that particular scenario, we do get a boom. And of course, this is what a lot of market people are saying. Oh, we're going to have a boom means we're going to have inflation, because historically, you had inflation. So that requires us to go and look at the underlying structural framework for the inflation process. It's not just, you know, we can look at it in the US data, we can look at it in the Euro data, we can look at it in multiple different countries. But what we do when we look at this underlying structural framework for inflation, you know, we ask the question, is it anchored? Okay, we can ask, you know, we know that. Look at five-year inflation swaps. It's surely anchored in the US. We can look at the role of commodity prices, particularly energy prices. Very important, gonna be a huge surge to inflation in 2021 because the base effects go from a $35 a barrel in Q2 of last year to a projected $70 a barrel in Q2 of this year. So on that alone, we got some big base effects happening. But on into 2022, we've got a headwind coming from energy after it comes off those highs. Okay, so we're anchored, inflation on the energy side, surge, but then a moderation. And then we have to look at the two key elements that are really the most important, which is labor markets and wage developments. So the Phillips curve sort of discussion. And, you know, on that score, you know, we don't have recovery of labor markets. This is something we've been kind of talking about here. We don't have recovery of labor markets in the US, at least in the US, until, you know, 2023, 2024. And in the Euro area, they don't even get back to pre-COVID GDP until 2022. And so the labor market scarring there goes on longer. And we could talk about the emerging markets as well as being further down the line. Latin America is looking at 2024. Perhaps a number of countries in Latin America are looking for that. So very sluggish return on the labor market side, which of course has implications for wage developments and also for capacity to consume, that demand component. And then we get to this final element, which is pricing power. In the end, you don't get inflation if companies can't raise their prices systematically and broad-based and sequentially. So you can ask them, do you have pricing power? Read the beige book. No. Read surveys. No. You ask them, you know, do you have pricing power? And certainly some companies do, but by and large, they don't. And you can also finish up this analysis, a framework for thinking about underpinnings of inflation. This is particularly relevant for the United States, where we're going to be running a big current account deficit. You know, our trade deficit is going to be driving the global economy in 2021, being an important driver, a global locomotive again. Under those circumstances, import competition disciplines firms' prices in the United States. Export competition, as everybody's trying to export to a few markets out there that are expanding, disciplines export price competition. And then finally, we have an appreciation of the dollar, and that just emphasizes further the constraints on ability of firms to raise their prices. So this is a way of thinking about, should we worry about inflation the way that Larry and Olivier are? Their approach, I think, is a very macro, and I think we ought to be thinking much more about the I don't want to call it micro because it's not really micro, but structural underpinnings of inflation across these dimensions. And then we could add on also the role that online platforms play for price discovery as being another discipline to firms' pricing power. So in the end, we come out with saying, yeah, there's going to be a big surge in 2021 or early on from base effects energy, but it all moderates because in the end, firms are restricted. There's a lot of tempering of their capacity to raise their prices. So, a different way of thinking from the market perspective or from the straight macro perspective on this particular topic.
That's very interesting. Joyce, love to hear your views on that topic, and then a slightly different one, which somebody's put in the questions, which is, are there banking services that are particularly good for or tailored for women? I think there are some attempts to develop that now and to market it, but I don't know if there really are. But go first to the question about this inflation, the inflation fears and the inflation growth trade-off and the fiscal monetary shift in the mix.
Yeah, so no, so I can just add to the excellent points that Penny and Cathy made, that look, we think that the 2021 global recovery is going to really be the strongest that we've seen since the mid-1980s, but I would characterize it as US exceptionalism. So global GDP growth, we have averaging, around 7.5%, an annualized rate in the middle quarters of the year. But in the second quarter, we have US growth at 9.5%, 8.3% in the third quarter of the year, just with the amount of stimulus online. And then you have the infrastructure will be discussed once the budget reconciliation process can be opened up again. And, a lot of the questions we get is like, why have they been, rushing all of this through? And I think a lot of that has to do with wanting to get this done before the midterm elections, just because incumbents have typically lost 20 seats at the midterm election. So US overheating, overstimulating, and it is more US exceptionalism. I mean, we're seeing a bifurcation with what China is doing. China is going towards more policy normalization. And we're seeing this policy divergence also when you look at the US and Europe, because I would say that, the Fed's stance has been kind of middle of the road. They've been somewhat permissive of the rate repricing, while the ECB has upscaled the PIP flows to really push back rising yields. So, we've had Treasury yields at the 10-year at close to 2% by the end of the year. Now, what does that all mean for inflation? And I just want to pick up on a couple of the points that were made earlier. First of all, that this is a services shock, we think means that inflation comes back more slowly. And then I think very much on Catherine's point that, you would have to really see broad-based wage gains. So you go back to full employment, but even like you get back to 4%, let's just say by 2023, you're not going to get broad-based wage gains. And this goes to some of the structural issues that we talked about, to begin with, like what kinds of jobs in the services sector there and what kind of wages will come back. And so I think one thing that is going to dampen some of those inflation pressures is the nature of this recession, that it will take longer for wages to recover, even if you do get back to an unemployment number that's closer to 4%. And when we look at the historical data, and we are at the structural shift point, but we have not seen that the size of the deficit and inflation actually have been that positively correlated since the Volcker Fed of the late 1970s and the 1980s. And we've seen that US core inflation has really failed to rise here. So I think that, look, the jury is still out, a period of overshooting, technical factors. I'm certainly agree very much that the surge in energy prices is going to make an impact as well. But I still think that there are more disinflationary forces that have come from this kind of shock, the nature of the shock to play out. So I would say that, you know, the inflation debate, I am less concerned about some of the alarmist scenarios I hear. But I think there's a couple questions I do get. Will the bond vigilantes be back? And well, this time they're fighting the Fed, so I don't actually think that's going to be very successful. But then I also get the question, will the EM vigilantes be back? And that could be somewhat more successful, just given the poor market liquidity and market structure and the size of some of the emerging markets that could be impacted. So that's a bit on the macro piece. Let me just try to talk a little bit about, are there certain things to do for women in financial services? So there's a couple of things that, just as JP Morgan's approach to go more into the community, more women-owned businesses that we looked at and that we've tried to tackle. First of all, just going to the whole issue of role models and pipeline, one thing we decided we needed to do was start earlier. So, you know, I've been on the board of this charity called Girls Inc. It works with middle school and high school age girls, but JP Morgan came out with a target that we're going to actually train 20,000 girls in financial literacy. And this was before the pandemic, but we actually had them come into the branches, and almost all of them are raised by single moms. So their moms came with them. And we developed like a whole savings plan for them. Then we developed something called Auto Save, which has been used predominantly by women, where just there's like an automatic savings. We wanted to get 1 million subscribers that you sign up for Auto Save and then just automatically part of this is put away. The other thing we looked at was women's access to capital in small businesses, because women's access to capital in small businesses, you know, it's a huge gap to men, like 18% of women, you know, compared to, it's much larger proportion of men. So we looked at how we could actually, you know, make credit more available as well. So I do think there are you know, financial services that can be directed towards women. You know, I think that starting younger, having the mothers involved is sort of a changer. That changes everything for the household, actually. Bringing them into the branches so it's not as intimidating, but also making sure that it can be done on the mobile app, you know, as well, and making sure that the technology is inclusive that way. The auto save, so that it's basically occurring without you having to make an effort about it. And then basically just looking at how you can apply this to small businesses that are women owned. And that has been trickier, but, you know, we had a target to lend $10 billion to women owned businesses. And we'd hit before the pandemic, like 3.76 billion. And then that has gone to now we're about like at 2/3 of the goal. So, but that requires like a concentrated effort to find the businesses, do the due diligence. I mean, it isn't something that actually occurs that easily. And when you look at scaling that, that's very complicated, you know, in my opinion. But those are just a few examples.
That's great. And we just have a couple of minutes left. So I would like to go to Penny and then to Cathy. And Penny, over to you.
I just want to make a point about inflation. So I agree that, so both Cathy and Joyce made the important point that the wage costs are important, and part of the reason inflation, or the main reason that inflation has been low in the past years, is because the labor market, the wage costs have been contained. I completely agree with them that the labor market is going to be weak in the foreseeable future. I wouldn't be as confident in how wage costs are going to evolve in the United States in the longer run. And one of my concerns is we also, one of the trends we see in the last few years is this turning inward in the United States, but in other advanced countries as well. I know I'm in the minority when I say that, but I do believe that globalization has put a lot of pressure on US wages, not directly, but indirectly. When you know that your job can potentially be outsourced, then you don't negotiate as hard. So it was globalization, it was also technology. Technology remains a force that disciplines wages. You know, it's still possible that your job will be replaced by a machine. But if globalization is out of the picture, then if we bring manufacturing back to the US, if we bring manufacturing back to France or Germany, if there is reshoring, I'm not sure that I would be as confident that wage costs are not going to go up. So I agree. I think Cathy said that very nicely, that import competition has to discipline this process. And if this doesn't happen, then who knows?
Yeah, and then I guess that in a way, some policymakers and others would be glad to see higher wage costs, provided that that comes out of company profits rather than being passed along to all of us in the form of inflation. Cathy, do you have any last word?
Just picking up on that issue about what globalization might look like going forward, I agree that there have been ongoing forces affecting the progress of globalization. We have not had increases in global integration for more than 10 years by standard kind of metrics. But I think the view for globalization going forward is going to be driven by a change in firms' vision of their own supply chains. They've been looking at not just at the political issues, but they've also been looking at the way in which their supply chains are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to a lot of risks. There was the COVID risk, it was the US-China trade war risk, but overwhelmingly, it's climate risk. They used to be able to ignore it when there was one flood or there's a Fukushima or there's, whatever. And they have realized that those climate risks are integral, have to be incorporated integrally into their supply chain strategy. That means diversification. Doesn't necessarily mean reshoring. It does mean diversification. You also have tremendous demands from consumers and from investors for greater transparency on carbon footprint. And so you've got transparency on carbon footprint, you've got demands for diversification. The only way you can actually do that and have that kind of new supply chain reconfiguration is to have much more digital and data incorporated into your supply chain so that it actually is flexible, resilient in the face of these variety of shocks that are becoming much more important. So that is a reconfigured globalization. I don't think we know whether that's more or less or just different. And if it's going to be more intensive in AI and in technology, that gets us back to our job discussion about making sure that we are able to match the skills with the jobs that are coming online.
So this is a very
Absolutely. Thank you.
I would just say that the political pressures are there. It's what the firms want, and it's what the political pressures have been for the past 5 to 10 years, and they have been enormous. Take the China-US trade war. No one believed this was possible. No one could ever anticipate what happened, and it did happen. And it did have important consequences, perhaps not that much on prices and welfare, but on investment, the consequences were big. And so that's why I'm saying that the political pressures are there, and we are not quite sure what the future is going to bring.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and we all want, I think one thing we can all agree on is that we want to make sure that the role of women is properly acknowledged, properly rewarded on the gender gap and the jobs gap. And I want to thank each and every one of you for what you're doing as role models, as supporters, as team players, and as brilliant economists. So thanks to Joyce Chang from JP Morgan Chase, to Penny Goldberg from Yale, and to Cathy Mann from Citi, from RockCreek Insights. Really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you, person to person soon.